Well, we're certainly thankful to have another beautiful day that we can come together and assemble in the presence of God and to study from His Word. And we're going to continue our study in the Olivet Discourse of Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. And we are down to verse 29. And in our study of the kingdom, the coming of this kingdom, this new everlasting kingdom, in which would have an everlasting covenant, a new covenant in which sin would be forgiven, we have been looking at some of the prophecies foretelling the coming of this kingdom. And so we are going, as I said, we're going to pick up our study in verse 29 of Matthew 24 here. And as we have been coming down through this text where Jesus is answering the questions of when shall these things be, and the disciples have asked, Jesus made the statement that every stone in the temple would be thrown down. The days were coming in which that would happen. They said, tell us, when shall this be? When shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming, your parousia, and of the end of the age? And they were looking for and anticipating the end of the Mosaic age, the Jewish age, the age represented by that Jewish temple. And so as Jesus is telling them these things and signs to watch for, and he's saying these things will happen, but the end is not yet. Then some more things are going to happen. You're going to see the abomination of desolation. The gospel is going to be preached in all the world for a witness, and so forth. And he says here in verse 28, for wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. And we notice the parallel in Luke 17, the last verse there in our last study, where Jesus said that there would, wheresoever the body is, there would the eagles be gathered together. And so then as we look at verse 29, Jesus says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. I'm going to go ahead and read the next two verses. And then, again, there's another time word, and immediately, there's a time word, see. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, okay, then he says, these things are going to happen. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with the sound of a great trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from the one end of heaven to the other. Now, again, I wanted to read these three verses together because this, even just this portion of these three verses, is what gives so many people today so many ideas and opinions and theories, and people will speculate and they try to interpret these things literally. And so because the physical universe still exists, then they say, well, these things haven't happened yet, of course, the stars have not fallen from heaven, and so forth. And so they come up with all these fanatical, or maybe not, that's not the right word, these fantastic theories and ideas, and like Tim LaHaye and the Left Behind series and the rapture, and they come up with all these ideas that when you study these things in context, that is not even close to what is being taught. And so again, verse 30 obviously is quoting, Jesus is quoting from Daniel 7, from which we have looked. But we want to look at this language, okay? And so this language of the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give her light, stars shall fall from heaven, powers in the heavens shall be shaken. What does this mean? And so this comes back to what we keep saying over and over again, and that is, if we allow Scripture to interpret Scripture, this is going to give us the best shot, the best chance at arriving at the contextual meaning of this kind of language. And so that is what we want to look at. We want to look at the language. Okay, we want to look at the Hebrew language, and that's the part of our study. And I want to look at 3 examples in the Old Testament of this kind of apocalyptic language, this hyperbolic language. So that's what we want to look at as we begin to look at verse 29 of Matthew 24. Okay, I want to look at Psalms 18. And when we look at this, we see that this is David's song of deliverance out of the hand of his adversary Saul. Saul was pursuing David and trying to kill him. And so David prays to Jehovah. And this is what we see here in verse 1 of Psalms 18. And so he says, I will call upon the Lord, verse 3, who is worthy to be praised, so shall I be saved from my enemies. The sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. Okay, again, just look at the symbology that is used in this verse right here. Floods. He's not talking about water, is he? No, he's using an analogy. As a flood would come in and just wipe everything out. He's using that as an analogy. It was a vast number of ungodly men. So this is how David perceived this threat. The sorrows of hell, or Sheol in the Hebrew, the sorrows of hell compassed me about, the snares of death prevented me. In my distress I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him even into his ears. And so what follows here now, what we're going to look at, is David's description of how Jehovah delivered him out of the hand of his enemy. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills were moved and were shaken, because he was wroth, because Jehovah was wroth. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils and fire out of his mouth. I read that wrong. Skip the comma. Let me do that again. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also and came down, and darkness was under his feet. He rode upon a cherub and did fly. Yea, he did fly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his secret place, his pavilion round about him, where dark waters and thick clouds of skies. At the brightness that was before him, his thick clouds passed, hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. All right, now, in this text, we see the example of David's description of his deliverance out of the hand of Saul. And again, notice the Hebrew language. And so Jehovah came down out of heaven with fire out of his mouth, with the voice of God. He bent or bowed the heavens. Smoke came out of his nostrils. He rode an angel around on the wind. The earth and mountains shook so that the hills were moved. He was accompanied with thunder, thick clouds, hailstones, coals of fire. And this gave way to the brightness of his coming. Now, did anyone see Jehovah in a visible body? Did anyone see the fierce clouds, fire, smoke, or the hailstones? Did the physical earth quake and the mountains move, or did the material universe burn up? Did time come to an end? Well, obviously, the answer is no, because we're still here. So this is an example of this Hebrew hyperbole and how this exaggerated language, David uses this language to describe the mighty fierceness of God's wrath and his vengeance in protecting David and destroying his enemy. All right, now in Isaiah chapter 13, we have a prophecy of the destruction that was about to come upon Babylon, and it is called the Day of the Lord. Verse 1 there, the burden of Babylon which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. Howl ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. Therefore shall all hands be faint, and every man's heart shall melt. and they shall be afraid. Pangs and sorrows shall take hold of them. They shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth. And see, there's the birth pangs motif that we've already looked at in the Olivet Discourse. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it, out of the land. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. All right, again, notice that this text, this event, is called the day of the Lord. Birth pangs, sorrows as a woman in travail, again, same motif that we see in the Olivet Discourse, as well as 1 Thessalonians chapters 4 through 5. The land would be laid desolate. The sun, moon, and stars are darkened. The heavens are shaken. The earth is removed out of her place. And the wrath of Jehovah is revealed upon the sinners. Now, was the material cosmos literally shaken? Did anyone see Jehovah come out of heaven in a visible body? Was the light from the sun, moon, and stars extinguished? Was the physical planet destroyed or moved out of its orbit even? Did time come to an end? Well, again, the obvious answer to these questions is no, because we're still here. This is another example of a day of the Lord judgment against a nation, Babylon. All right. In chapter 34, then, is an event that is predicted as destruction of Edom that was about to take place. It, too, is referred to as the day of the Lord. All right. For the indignation of the Lord is against all nations, and his fury against their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has given them over to the slaughter. Now, I emphasize the word has there because I want you to notice the proleptic nature of the statement. It hasn't taken place yet. This is foretelling the event that's about to take place, but it's already spoken of as if it has taken place. Okay, that's the proleptic nature of this statement. Because God said this, it's as sure as done. Also, their slain shall be thrown out. Their stench shall rise from their corpses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. Now, I forgot to mention, in these texts that I'm referring to, Psalms 18 and Isaiah, these two past texts here in Isaiah, read all these chapters, okay? Because I don't have time to read all of them, but take the time to do that. Read those chapters thoroughly. Okay, now, all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. All their hosts shall fall down, as the leaf falls from the vine, and as the fruit falling from a fig tree. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Indeed, it shall come down on Edom, and on the people of my curse or judgment. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is made overflowing with fatness, with the blood of lambs and of goats, with the fat of kidneys and of rams, for the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah, a great slaughter in the land of Edom. The wild oxen shall come down with them, and the young bulls with the mighty bulls. Their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust saturated with fatness. For it is the day of the Lord. See that? It is the day of the Lord's vengeance, the year of recompense for the cause of Zion. Now notice this. Its streams shall be turned into pitch, and its dust into brimstone, and the land shall become burning pitch. It shall not be quenched night or day. Its smoke shall ascend forever. From generation to generation it shall lie waste. No one shall pass through it forever and ever. But the pelican and the porcupine shall possess it. Also the owl and the raven shall dwell in it, and he shall stretch out over it the line of confusion and the stones of emptiness. They shall call its nobles to the kingdom, but none shall be there, and all its princes shall be nothing. And thorns shall come up in its palaces, nettles and brambles in its fortresses. It shall be a habitation of jackals, a courtyard for ostriches. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the jackals, and the wild goat shall blate for his companion. Also the night creature shall rest there, and find for herself a place of rest. There the arrow snake shall make her nest, and lay eggs, and hatch, and gather them under her shadow. There also shall the hawks be gathered, every one with her mate. All right, now, again, notice that in this text, that this event being foretold is called the day of the Lord. The mountains would be melted with their blood, the blood of the slain. All the host of heaven shall be dissolved, the exact same language you find in 2 Peter 3. The heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll, the exact same language in Psalms 102, which is quoted in Hebrews 1. All their host shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine. Jehovah's sword would come down out of heaven. The land would be soaked with blood, the streams turned into pitch, the dust and land turned into burning brimstone. The smoke would ascend up forever. The fires would never be quenched, even though the wildlife and vegetation would dwell there. Now, were the material, physical sun, moon, and stars dissolved? Did anyone see Jehovah's sword come out of heaven? Did the heavens cease to exist? Is the literal landscape still burning with brimstone today? Did time come to an end? All right, again, the obvious answer is no, we're still here. And again, this is another example of Hebrew hyperbole, this apocalyptic language of judgment, God's judgment against a nation. Okay, so as we look at these things and these examples that we have seen here, and there's more that we could look at, but these are three just, I say dandy examples that we could look at in comparing this type of language that we find right here in the Olivet Discourse, as well as in places, especially in the book of Revelation, in 2 Peter chapter 3, and we see this same kind of language. And so again, if we allow Scripture to interpret Scripture, then that's how we're going to arrive at what this language means. Okay, and because there has, and I hate to be Captain Obvious here, but because there has never been an event that was described with this type of language that resulted in the end of time and the end of the material universe, then what right do we have to come to the New Testament and see this same kind of language and then translate it and interpret it in a way that results in the end of the material universe and the end of time and all of human history? See, that's inconsistent. Especially since, for instance, Peter says in 2 Peter 3 that he is reminding them of the words spoken before by the holy prophets. And in our text in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus is quoting, citing, and echoing these Old Testament prophecies. And so then when we come back to our verse here, where Jesus says immediately after the tribulation of those days, well, we saw that he mentioned this in verse 21, for then shall be great tribulation, and as he is quoting from Daniel 12 and verse 1. Okay? And again, read that entire chapter. And so then he says, he's telling them that they are going to see this. He tells them in verses 14 and 15 that the gospel will be preached in all the world for a witness to all nations then. shall the end come. And we looked at the passages where Paul said no less than 6 times that that mission had been accomplished during his ministry. Jesus in verse 15 points out the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. That's in chapter 12. That's why I say read all of Daniel 12. And so he says then immediately after this tribulation. Well, 2,000 years and counting is not immediately after. Okay, so if language means anything, and it does, then if we are consistent and use consistent study principles, hermeneutics, okay, then we're going to honor what this text says immediately after the tribulation of those days, okay? And he says the sun would be darkened. The moon would not give her light. Okay, now here he is conflating prophecies from Joel. Okay, and that's what we want to look at. When we go back to Joel chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, and again, read all of chapter 2 and all of chapter 3, because we're just going to touch some highlights here as we go through this. All right, Joel begins there, blow you the trumpet in Zion, a sound, an alarm in my holy, notice that, blow the trumpet. Okay, and we get to the trumpet down in verse 31. But anyway, blow the trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all inhabitants of the land tremble. Why? For the day of the Lord comes, for it is nigh at hand. A day of darkness and of gloominess, a day of clouds and of thick darkness. Again, same language you just looked at in these previous examples. As the morning spread upon the mountains, a great people and a strong, there, now notice this, there hath not been ever the like, neither shall there be any more after it, even to the years of many generations. So Joel, in beginning this prophecy here, is predicting a day of the Lord in which there's never been the like, even though there's been past destructions and judgments that we just looked at, for instance, that was called the day of the Lord. He is foretelling one that there's never been anything like it, and there'll never be anything like it afterwards. Okay, so this is going to be a unique, a one-time event. And let me, as a side note, notice that he says here, for the day of the Lord cometh, for it is nigh at hand. Okay, now a lot of people make the mistake of saying, well, now Joel prophesied X number 100 years before this actually took place, if AD 70 is what he's talking about. So that destroys your idea of at hand being in the same generation. Well, no, because as you read on down through the chapter, and you get down toward the end of the chapter, this is posited in the last days, and we'll see that as we go on. Okay, he's making the prediction. It's at hand, but it's posited in this event is posited in the last days, and we've already established that this biblical last days period of time began with the ministry of John the Baptist. Jesus said the law and the prophets were until John, Luke 16:16. All right, now if we drop on down in Joel just a little bit, verse 9, they shall run to and fro in the city, they shall run upon the wall, they shall climb upon the houses, they shall enter in at the windows like a thief. The earth, now notice, the earth shall quake before them, the heavens shall tremble, the sun and the moon shall be dark, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. And the Lord shall utter his voice, and there's the voice of God again, the Lord shall utter his voice before his army, and remember, we've looked at the passages in previous study, that he is the Lord of Sabaoth, Lord of armies. The Lord shall utter his voice before his army, for his camp is very great, for he is strong that executeth his word, for the day of the Lord is great and very terrible, who can abide it? Now again, as I said, this day of the Lord is posited more specifically as we get on down, and this is why I say that we have to take the at-hand statement and put it in the context that Joel puts it in. All right, now in verse 23, he says, be glad then, you children of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he hath given you the former rain moderately, and he will cause to come down for you the rain, the former rain, and the latter rain in the first month. All right, now, does that sound familiar? Well, it should, because this language is used in multiple places in predicting the day of the Lord And one of them is right here in James 5, where James said, "Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the," and that's the parousia. That word there in the Greek is the parousia. So this is the same coming of the Lord that we are studying in the Olivet Discourse, the parousia of the Lord. All right, be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. So again, the question is, why, if the day of the Lord, this day of the Lord, was not to happen for at least some 2,000 years, why would James tell those people right there, his audience, the Jewish diaspora, why would he tell them to be patient until the coming of the Lord? Again, if language means anything, we need to respect the time statements that are found in these texts. All right, behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath long patience for it, until he receive the early and the latter rain. Be ye also patient, establish your hearts, for the coming, parousia, of the Lord draweth nigh. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth before the door. So James said twice there, posited the parousia of the Lord and the lifetime of those people, and told them that the judge is standing right at the door. All right, now if we go on in Joel, drop down just a little bit further, this is the part of Joel that everybody's familiar with, because Peter quotes this portion on the day of Pentecost, which is recorded in Acts chapter 2. And so what Joel says, and it shall come to pass afterward, Peter interprets as, when he says, this is that was spoken by the prophet Joel, it shall come to pass in the last days, saith God. So Peter quotes Joel, and he interprets it shall come to pass afterward as it shall come to pass in the last days. And so this was when the day of the Lord was posited, this coming of the Lord. Okay, all right, now if we look at Joel 2, he says, it'll come to pass afterward, I'll pour out my spirit upon all flesh, your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. And also upon the servants and upon the handmaids in those days will I pour out my spirit. And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. Notice now, the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before, excuse me, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord has said, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call. So there's the idea of the elect, again, the remnant. All right, now again, notice the sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. Well, again, Joel had just said this in verse 10, the earth shall quake before them, the heavens shall tremble, the sun and the moon shall be dark, the stars shall withdraw their shine. So another pattern that we see here is the prophets predicting an event and predicting it multiple times. And we see the same pattern in the book of Revelation. It's the same event. It's one event, but it is recapitulated many times through that vision. Okay, so that's what we see here. So he's saying the same thing in verse 10 that he is saying in verse 31. And so, and I wanted to just, we're passing over this, I wanted to make a side note here, that where Joel says it'll come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord, you see Peter interprets that and quotes that, in verse 21 there, that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And so, what did Peter tell those people to do that day when they said, men and brethren, what must we do? He told them to repent and to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins. All right? That is how Peter demonstrated calling on the name of the Lord. All right? In Acts 22 and verse 16, Saul of Tarsus. Now notice, Saul of Tarsus was down praying. He had prayed for 3 days and nights and fasted and prayed for 3 days and nights. He was down praying when Ananias came to him. Ananias said, and now what tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized, and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. And so, again, Ananias applying this prophecy of Joel, which Peter quoted on Pentecost Day, and then Saul, who became the Apostle Paul, of course, he also quoted this text in Romans chapter 10, and you can read it there, verses 12 through, actually back up and start about verse 9 and read down through verse 18. But read that text there, because Paul quotes the same passage, whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And I point this out in passing because this is the verse most people go to right here to try to establish the sinner's prayer, to try to evade baptism, when it's perfectly defined, specifically defined as being baptized to wash away sins by Saul, or by Ananias rather, to Saul, there in Acts 22 and verse 16. So I wanted to throw that in passing. All right, now we go back to Joel, and we see this prophecy here, this block of prophecy that Peter quotes on Pentecost Day, recorded in Acts chapter 2. And because we have been trained to primarily look at only the New Testament, this is the only portion of Joel that we have been familiarized with. Because we go to Acts 2, and when we go to verse 21 there, then Peter begins his sermon based on this text here. So we drop Joel. We don't go on and read Joel. Here's what I want you to see. All right, he says that whosoever will call on the name of the Lord would be saved. All right, now, the very next words off the pen of the prophet is for. For is a conjunction. It is a connective particle. And it joins together what he is about to say with what he has already said. And that's why I say it's important that we read all these texts. Don't pay attention to the chapter break. That wasn't there in the original letter. Okay? So when he says, for behold in those days and in that time, well, in what days? In what time? In the last days that he's just been talking about. And see, again, that's why I say we miss so many things because we don't read the entirety of these texts. For behold in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. Okay, now I'm not going to read the text, but there is the text. This is parallel with Zechariah 14 verses 1 through 9. Again, read all of that. Read the whole chapter. Actually, read chapters 12 through 14. But this is parallel with what Zechariah says here, and we've already looked at this in a previous study. So when we drop on down in chapter 3 of Joel, then, notice what he says here. Let the heathen be wakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there will I sit to judge all the heathen round about. Put ye in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, get you down, for the press is full. The fats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. So here in Joel, he's mentioned this day of the Lord. This is the third or fourth time now. Fourth time, I believe, that he has mentioned the day of the Lord. All right, now notice, the sun and the moon shall be darkened, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. See again, there he's saying the same thing again. And this is why I say Jesus conflates this language and these prophecies in the Olivet Discourse. Okay, the Lord also shall roar out of Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall shake. But the Lord will be the hope of his people and the strength of the children of Israel. So shall you know that I am the Lord your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain. Then shall Jerusalem be holy, and there shall no strangers pass through her any more. And it shall come to pass in that day that the mountains shall drop down new wine, and the hills shall flow with milk, and all the rivers of Judah shall flow with waters, and a fountain shall come forth out of the house of the Lord and shall water the valley of Shittim. Again, go back and read Zechariah 14, because that's what he says there. Egypt shall be a desolation, and Edom shall be a desolate wilderness for the violence against the children of Judah, for they have shed innocent blood in their land. But Judah shall dwell forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation. In verse 21, that's cut off at the bottom there, talks about the purging of the blood, because Israel has shed innocent blood. Okay, so again, we see this language, this hyperbole, that is used over and over and over again in the Old Testament. And we see this language that is being used to describe a day of the Lord judgment event. But this was going to be one that there had never been anything like it before. And there's going to be one like there would never be another one like it. So again, I say that this is a unique event. And that's why Jesus would say, when he quoted from Daniel, the Great Tribulation, it'd be a time of trouble such as had never been, and it would never be again. And so then we see that Jesus says here in verse 29, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven. Well, we look at a passage here, and I want you to know this is really interesting. When we go back and look at Genesis 37, and Joseph dreamed a dream. He told it to his brethren, and they hated him, yet of course they hated him already, because Joseph was a young lad in Jacob's old age, probably more like a grandson than a son. But you remember Jacob made the coat of many colors for Joseph, but his older brethren despised him because they were jealous. But he dreamed this dream, he told it to his brethren, and they hated him even more. And he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright, and behold, your sheaves stood around about and made obeisance, in other words, they bowed down to my sheaf. And his brethren said unto him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us? Or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. Okay, now, number one, look at the importance that they put on dreams back at this time. And then number two, look at how they interpreted the dream. And I mean, this represented something, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. Yeah, in the dream, you dream something, and what you're seeing in your dream is a literal material thing, but it represents something. And that's what we see here. And this goes back to the concept of the literal, the physical. The material things point to the spiritual. And that's how they interpreted this. The sheaves bowing down was a symbol. It represented Joseph having dominion over his brother. They would bow down to him, in other words. And they're scoffing at that. But then he has another dream. He dreamed yet another dream, and told it to his brethren, and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren, and his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth? All right, again, look at what this represents. Look at how this is interpreted. The sun and the moon and the stars, particularly the stars. Because the stars in his dream represented the patriarchs who would become the heads of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. So again, that's why I say this is such an interesting passage here. And again, read the whole chapter. But this is such an interesting text here, and how that in this dream, the stars, the sun represented Jacob, of course, the father. The moon the mother, Rachel, and then the 11 stars were his brothers, again, who became the heads of the tribes of Israel. And so these dreams, they represented things. And so we see how, now this is not in every text. We have to go by the context. There's places where stars and sun and moon is to be interpreted as the actual sun and moon and stars. But it depends on the context. And so, as we have just looked at Isaiah 34, in that example, all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and their host, that'd be the stars, shall fall down. Well, again, there's never been a star that fell to the earth. Now, we've seen meteorites, sure, like the big hunk of rock that fell out there in just west of Winslow, Arizona, and created that big crater, big meteor crater. But there's never been a star, a material, gaseous star that fell to the earth. This is hyperbole. This is Hebrew language, okay? And, of course, we see the parallel in Luke 1, verse 25, where he said, there will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and upon the earth, distress of nations. The Lord is going to be coming to lay the land desolate. That's the terminology, okay? All right, and then we see this again in Revelation chapter 6 under the sixth seal, that the stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs. And again, this is a text where you need to read the whole chapter. But when he opened the fifth seal, he says, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. They cried with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, there's time there. There's time in heaven, in this vision, time. How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? White robes were given to every one of them, and it was said unto them that they should rest for yet a little season. There's time, again. And I contend that this little season is the little while of Hebrews 10 and verse 37. But anyway, they were told to rest for yet a little season until their fellow servants also of their brethren that would be killed as they had, and that would be fulfilled. Okay, then in verse 12 is the opening of the sixth seal. Now notice this. There was a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth of hair. The moon became as blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. Again, it's the same language that we've seen over and over again in these texts. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together. Again, that's taken from Psalms 102, which Paul is quoting in Hebrews 1, verse 26 there of Psalms 102. But here we see the same language. The heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together. Every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Kings of the earth and the great men and the rich men, the chief captains and the mighty men, every bondman and every free man hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains. Remember what we studied previously in Isaiah 2, this day of the Lord judgment, a last day of the Lord judgment in Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, where we have this exact language, enter into the rock, hide thee in the dust, for the fear of the Lord, for the glory of his majesty. And that phrase quoted verbatim by Apostle Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. You see, we studied that in previous lesson. It's repeated there in verses 19 and verse 21 of Isaiah 2. And they said to the rocks and the mountains, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, for the wrath of the Lamb is come, for the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? Okay, so again, this is the same language that we see Jesus using here in the Olivet Discourse. That immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, and we're going to talk about the powers of the heavens being shaken in the next study, so that we don't make this, way too long. But we see this language here, And we need to study the way that the Hebrew people thought, the way these ancients looked at things. And, we can make a comparison like that if some foreign country came in and invaded us and utterly destroyed Washington, D.C., destroyed a bunch of cities, and completely changed our way of living, put us in slavery, wouldn't we say that our world come to an end? Isn't that just a common way of us saying things? That's the way that they thought. A nation, a huge city like Babylon, for instance, that was their world. The people lived there. Jerusalem, this was the center of God's religion, the religious system. And so this was heavens and earth to the Jews. And even Josephus referred to the Jewish temple as heavens and earth in his writings, and that he was a Pharisee. But anyway, those are just things to think about while we actually look at what the texts say. And so again, because Jesus says immediately after the tribulation of those days, and since Jesus applied the Great Tribulation to the time period that would immediately precede the siege and destruction of Jerusalem and the slaughter that took place there, then we must understand that this language is not foretelling some end of time, catastrophic, cataclysmic destruction of the universe and the end of all of human history. This was an in-history event, not a history-ending event. And so, as I said, we'll stop with our study here, and I want to have a little more time to look at this idea of what it means to shake heavens and earth. The powers of the heavens would be shaken. So we'll stop here then this morning with our study.